The sun was setting as Mrs. Betty Williams pulled up to the Grand Palace Hotel in a taxi. The beautiful golden light made the tall glass building shine like a diamond against the sky. Betty had saved money all year for this special weekend trip. After working for 42 years teaching little children at Pine Street Elementary School, she felt she deserved this small treat. Betty paid the taxi driver and carefully stepped out, her old knees making it a bit hard to move quickly. She had been coming to this hotel every year since her husband James passed away 5 years ago. It was their special place, and staying here made her feel close to him again. "I hope they still have those warm cookies at the check-in desk," Betty thought with a smile as she pulled her small blue suitcase behind her. The doorman held the big glass door open, and Betty nodded with a "Thank you, young man," as she walked into the cool lobby. The inside of the hotel was even more beautiful than she remembered. Fancy lights hung from the high ceiling, and the marble floor was so shiny Betty could almost see her reflection in it. Soft piano music played in the background, and the smell of fresh flowers filled the air. Betty looked around, but didn't see any of the friendly faces that usually greeted her. Strange. Mr. Thompson, the kind old manager who always remembered her name, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, unfamiliar people in crisp uniforms moved quickly around the lobby. They must have hired new staff, Betty thought as she slowly made her way to the front desk. Her arthritis was acting up a bit today, making each step a little painful, but the thought of the soft hotel bed waiting for her kept her going forward. A young woman behind the desk was busy typing on a computer. Betty stood patiently, her hands resting on her purse, a warm smile on her face. After a minute, when no one looked up, she gently cleared her throat. "Excuse me, dear," Betty said in her soft voice. "I have a reservation for this weekend. The name is Williams, Betty Williams." The young woman finally looked up from her computer screen. "One moment, please," she said, quickly typing something. Her fingers moved so fast across the keyboard that Betty was impressed. In her day, they used typewriters that needed a good strong push for each letter. Betty looked around the lobby while waiting. A family with 2 small children was checking in at another desk. The little boy, maybe 5 years old, dropped his teddy bear, and Betty smiled as his sister helped pick it up. It reminded her of all the children she had taught over the years. "I don't see your reservation, ma'am," the young woman said, frowning at her screen. "Oh, that can't be right," Betty said, reaching into her purse for her phone. Her grandson Thomas had shown her how to use email on her phone, and she was quite proud that at 78 she could handle this technology. "I have the confirmation right here. I made it 3 months ago." As Betty was searching through her emails, a tall man in an expensive-looking suit approached the desk. He had a stern look on his face as he glanced at Betty and then at the young woman. "Is there a problem here, Jessica?" he asked, his voice sharp. Little did Betty know that this simple question would be the beginning of a weekend very different from what she had planned, one that would test her dignity, reveal ugly truths, and ultimately lead to unexpected changes for everyone involved. The tall man in the expensive suit looked down at Betty with cold eyes. His name tag read Mr. Wilson, hotel manager. He had only been working at the Grand Palace Hotel for 3 weeks, but he already acted like he owned the place. "What seems to be the issue here?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice sounding friendly enough, but his eyes told a different story. "This lady says she has a reservation, but I can't find it in our system," Jessica explained, still clicking through screens on her computer. Betty finally found the email on her phone. "Here it is, right here," she said proudly, holding up her phone to show them. "Confirmation number and everything. I made it 3 months ago, just like I do every year." Mr. Wilson barely glanced at her phone. Instead, he looked Betty up and down, taking in her simple dress and comfortable shoes. His eyes lingered on her well-worn suitcase. "Ma'am, this is the Grand Palace Hotel," he said slowly, as if talking to a child. "Our rooms start at $400 per night. Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" Betty felt her cheeks grow warm. Of course she knew where she was. She'd been coming here for years. "Yes, young man, I'm quite sure," she said, her teacher voice coming out a little. "I've been staying here every May for the past 5 years. Mr. Thompson usually handles my check-in." "Mr. Thompson no longer works here," Mr. Wilson said flatly. "And I find it unusual that you would have a reservation with us." A couple waiting behind Betty shifted uncomfortably. The woman whispered something to her husband, who frowned and looked over at them. "I don't understand," Betty said, confused by his tone. "I have the confirmation right here. I paid the deposit with my credit card." She reached again for her purse to get her wallet. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Mr. Wilson said loudly so other guests could hear. "We cater to a certain type of clientele here at the Grand Palace." Betty's hand froze halfway to her purse. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? "Excuse me," she asked quietly. "There are other hotels down the street that might be more suitable for your budget," Mr. Wilson continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "The Comfort Inn is just 3 blocks away." Now Betty understood perfectly well what was happening. It wasn't about her reservation at all. It was about who Mr. Wilson thought she was, an old black woman who couldn't possibly afford to stay in his fancy hotel. "Young man," Betty said, standing as straight as her tired back would allow, "I taught mathematics to children in this city for 42 years. I own my home. I have no debt. And I have been a loyal customer of this hotel since before you were probably born." A small crowd had gathered now. Jessica looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Betty and her boss. Mr. Wilson's smile disappeared completely. "Be that as it may, we seem to have no record of your reservation. And unfortunately, we are fully booked this weekend." "But you just checked in that family," Betty pointed out, nodding toward the couple with children who had finished their check-in. "So you do have rooms available." "Those were confirmed reservations," Mr. Wilson said coldly. "Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave before you cause more of a scene." "A scene?" Betty repeated, her voice rising slightly. "I'm not causing any scene. I just want the room I paid for." Mr. Wilson signaled to a security guard standing by the entrance. "Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our guests." The security guard, a young man with kind eyes, approached slowly. He looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to come with me," he said quietly. Betty stood there, shocked. In all her 78 years, through all the changes she'd seen in the world, she never expected to be thrown out of a hotel she'd been visiting for years. And all because a man took one look at her and decided she didn't belong. Little did Mr. Wilson know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Betty felt all eyes on her as the young security guard gently took her elbow. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and her heart was beating so fast she worried she might get sick right there on the fancy marble floor. "This isn't right," a woman's voice called out from somewhere in the lobby. Betty turned to see a young lady with glasses holding up her phone. "I'm recording this. You can't just throw people out because of how they look." Mr. Wilson's face turned an angry shade of red. "Put that phone away, or you'll be asked to leave too." The security guard, whose name tag read Kevin, looked deeply troubled. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry," he whispered to Betty as he slowly walked her toward the door. "If it was up to me." Betty nodded, understanding. The poor boy was just doing his job. Probably needed it to pay his bills, maybe for school. She wouldn't make trouble for him. Outside, the beautiful golden sunset was gone. Dark clouds had rolled in, and a light rain had started to fall. Betty hadn't brought an umbrella because the weather report had said the rain wouldn't start until later that night. Another thing gone wrong. Kevin looked up at the sky, then back at Betty. "Let me call you a taxi at least." "Thank you, young man," Betty said, her voice shaking a little. "But I need a minute to figure out where I'm going to go." Kevin hesitated, clearly torn between his job and what he knew was right. "I can wait with you until—" "Kevin," Mr. Wilson's sharp voice cut through the air. "You're needed inside." With one last apologetic look, Kevin hurried back into the hotel, leaving Betty alone on the sidewalk as the rain began to fall harder. Betty moved to a small covered area near the entrance and sat down on a bench. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, trying to think who to call. Her best friend Gladys was visiting her daughter in Florida. Her neighbor Mrs. Chen didn't drive. And her son Thomas was supposed to be in Chicago for a business meeting. Betty didn't want to bother him with this. He worked so hard, always traveling for his business. He told her he was working on something big these past few months, something that kept him up at night with excitement. She'd been so proud listening to him talk about his plans, even if she didn't understand all the business terms he used. The rain was now coming down in sheets. Betty watched as happy couples and families rushed into the hotel, the doorman greeting them with a big umbrella and a smile. No one seemed to notice the elderly woman sitting alone on a bench, her suitcase getting splashed by passing cars. A group of young people walked by, laughing and talking loudly. One of them, a girl with bright pink hair, spotted Betty and stopped. "Are you okay, ma'am?" she asked, concern in her eyes. "You're getting all wet." "I'm fine, dear," Betty said automatically, the way she always did when people asked. Always being strong, never showing when things hurt. The girl looked uncertain but rejoined her friends when they called for her. Betty watched them go, suddenly feeling every one of her 78 years weighing her down. She hadn't cried when they'd made her leave the school after 42 years of teaching. She hadn't cried when James died, at least not where anyone could see. She'd always been the strong one, the one others leaned on. But now, sitting alone in the rain, humiliated and treated like she was nothing, Betty felt tears mixing with the raindrops on her face. She finally opened her phone and found Thomas's number. He always told her to call if she needed anything, no matter what. As she pressed the call button, she didn't know that miles away, her son was already receiving multiple messages about what had happened to his mother. And Thomas Williams was not a man who let anyone hurt his mother. Thomas Williams sat at the head of a long table in a meeting room on the 30th floor of a Chicago skyscraper. 6 men and women in expensive suits looked at him nervously as he reviewed the final paperwork. So with these signatures, the Grand Palace Hotel chain officially becomes part of Williams Hospitality Group, Thomas said, his deep voice filling the room. At 45, Thomas had built his company from nothing into one of the fastest-growing hotel management companies in the country. The lawyer beside him nodded. "Yes, Mr. Williams, you'll officially own all 12 Grand Palace locations as of today." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He'd been working on this deal for 8 months, and it had finally come together. He couldn't wait to tell his mother. Betty Williams had raised him alone after his father died, working 2 jobs to put food on the table. She'd spent her life teaching other people's children while making sure her own son had everything he needed to succeed. Buying the Grand Palace chain wasn't just a good business move, it was personal. The flagship hotel was where his parents had spent their honeymoon, where his father had proposed, and where his mother still went every year to feel close to her late husband. Thomas had planned to surprise her this weekend with the news that her son now owned her favorite place in the world. Just as Thomas picked up his pen to sign, his phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and again. He glanced down, annoyed at the interruption, but his irritation turned to concern when he saw over a dozen messages pouring in. The first was from his assistant, "Call me ASAP. Emergency about your mother." His heart dropped. Was she hurt? Had there been an accident? The next message was from a college friend who lived in his hometown. "Thomas, you need to see this video going around. It's your mom at the Grand Palace." More messages followed, all mentioning a video, all expressing outrage. Thomas's hand shook slightly as he opened a link to a social media post. The video started playing, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. There was his mother, standing at the front desk of the Grand Palace Hotel, being told she didn't belong there. Being accused of causing a scene when she was clearly the calmest person in the lobby. Being escorted out by security while a man in a suit, presumably the manager, watched with a smug expression. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Williams, is everything all right?" Thomas held up one finger, signaling for silence as he continued watching. The video ended with his mother sitting alone in the rain. His phone rang. It was his mother's number. "Excuse me," Thomas said to the room, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I need to take this." He stepped into the hallway. "Mom? Are you okay?" Betty's voice sounded small on the other end. "Tommy? I'm sorry to bother you during your meeting." "You're never bothering me," Thomas said firmly. "What happened?" "I just saw a video." "Oh," Betty said, her voice catching. "You saw that? I didn't want you to worry." Thomas could hear the rain in the background. "Mom, where are you right now?" "Still outside the hotel. I'm not sure where to go. Everything's booked for the festival this weekend." Thomas checked his watch. "Stay right there. I'm coming to get you." "But your big meeting." "Can wait," Thomas finished. "I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't move." Thomas ended the call and walked back into the meeting room, his mind racing. Everyone looked up expectantly. "I need to postpone the final signing until tomorrow morning," Thomas announced. The lawyer looked alarmed. "But the press release is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon," Thomas finished. "We'll still make it, but right now I have a family emergency." As the room erupted in concerned whispers, Thomas leaned over to his assistant who had just entered the room. "Get the corporate jet ready," he said quietly, "and call the Grand Palace. Tell them I'd like a meeting with the manager as soon as I arrive." "Should I tell them who you are?" his assistant asked, already typing on her tablet. Thomas thought of his mother sitting alone in the rain because some man decided she didn't look like she belonged in a fancy hotel. "No," Thomas said, a cold determination in his voice. "I think Mr. Wilson should be surprised." The Grand Palace Hotel looked different in the evening light. Rain still fell steadily, making the building's glass front shimmer under the glow of street lamps. Thomas Williams stepped out of his taxi, spotting his mother immediately. Betty sat huddled under the small covered area near the entrance, her suitcase at her feet. "Mom," Thomas called, hurrying over with an umbrella. Despite the rain and his expensive suit, he knelt down in front of her and took her hands. "I'm so sorry this happened." Betty looked up, relief flooding her tired face. "Tommy, you didn't need to come all this way. Your meeting is less important than you," Thomas said firmly. He noticed her hands were cold and her clothes damp. Anger fled inside him, but he kept his voice gentle. "Let's get you dried off and warm." "But they won't let me inside," Betty said quietly. Thomas helped his mother to her feet. "They will now." As they approached the entrance, the doorman rushed forward with an umbrella. He looked surprised to see Betty returning with a well-dressed man. Thomas nodded politely but said nothing as they walked through the grand doors into the lobby. The hotel was busy now, the evening crowd filling the space with chatter and movement. Thomas spotted Mr. Wilson immediately. The manager stood at the front desk, speaking to a wealthy-looking couple. His smile was wide, his manner completely different from how he treated Betty. "Wait here, Mom," Thomas said, guiding her to a comfortable chair near a fireplace. "I need to speak with someone." Thomas walked straight to the front desk, standing quietly behind the couple Mr. Wilson was checking in. He watched how the manager fawned over them, offering champagne and upgrade options. When the couple moved away with their keys, Thomas stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson?" Thomas asked, his voice calm. The manager's professional smile appeared instantly. "Yes, sir. How may I help you this evening?" "I'd like to speak with you about an incident that occurred earlier today," Thomas said. "It involves an elderly woman who was removed from your hotel despite having a confirmed reservation." Mr. Wilson's smile faltered slightly. "Sir, I assure you that any actions taken by our staff are in accordance with hotel policy to ensure the comfort of all our guests." "All your guests?" Thomas repeated. "Or just the ones you think look like they belong here?" Mr. Wilson's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but if you're referring to the woman who was causing a disturbance earlier—" "I'm referring to my mother," Thomas interrupted, his voice still quiet but with an edge that made several nearby staff members look up. "Betty Williams. The woman who has been a loyal customer of this hotel for years. The woman you humiliated and forced to sit in the rain for hours." Mr. Wilson blinked, finally noticing the resemblance between Thomas and Betty. His face paled slightly. "Your mother?" There was a misunderstanding with her reservation." "A misunderstanding?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Let's clear that up right now. My mother showed you her confirmation email. You claimed you were fully booked while checking in other guests right in front of her. What exactly was misunderstood?" By now, several guests had stopped to watch. Jessica, the front desk clerk from earlier, was staring wide-eyed at the scene. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this in my office," Mr. Wilson suggested, glancing nervously at the growing audience. "No," Thomas said firmly. "You didn't offer my mother privacy when you humiliated her. You did it right here in this lobby, so we'll resolve it right here too." Mr. Wilson's professional demeanor began to crack. "Look, we had concerns about her ability to. That is, sometimes people make reservations without understanding the caliber of our establishment." "The caliber of your establishment?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising slightly. "My mother taught mathematics at Lincoln High School for 42 years. She raised me alone after my father died. She put me through college working 2 jobs. She owns her home outright and has perfect credit. What exactly about her didn't meet your caliber?" Mr. Wilson opened and closed his mouth, unable to find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. Thomas turned and gestured to Betty, who hesitantly stood and walked over to join him. The lobby had gone completely silent. "Now," Thomas said, placing a protective arm around his mother's shoulders, "about that reservation." Mr. Wilson pulled at his tie nervously. "We might be able to find a room for your mother after all," he said, his voice suddenly much friendlier. "Perhaps there was a computer error with her reservation." "A computer error," Thomas repeated slowly. Interesting how these errors seem to affect only certain people. Kevin, the security guard who had escorted Betty out earlier, had moved closer to the front desk. He looked torn between fear for his job and relief that someone was standing up to Mr. Wilson. "Mr. Wilson," Jessica spoke up from behind the counter, "I can check again for Mrs. Williams's reservation." The manager shot her a warning look, but Jessica pretended not to notice as she typed on her computer. "Oh look," she said with exaggerated surprise, "there is a reservation for Mrs. Betty Williams. A deluxe room with a view, just as she said." Mr. Wilson's face turned red. "Well, there you have it. A simple mistake. We'll get her checked in right away." "This wasn't a mistake," Thomas said, his voice steady. "This was discrimination, and I think everyone here knows it." Several guests nodded. The woman who had been recording earlier stepped forward. "I have the whole thing on video," she offered. "The way he spoke to your mother was disgraceful." Mr. Wilson glared at her. "Hotel policy clearly states that recording on premises is not permitted." "Actually," Thomas said, "there's nothing in the policy about guests recording in public areas of the hotel. I've read it very carefully." Mr. Wilson frowned. "And how would you know that, sir?" Thomas smiled for the first time since arriving. "Because I've been reviewing all the policies of the Grand Palace hotel chain for the past 8 months. "I don't understand," Mr. Wilson said, his confusion evident. Thomas reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward Mr. Wilson. "Thomas Williams, CEO of Williams Hospitality Group," he announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "As of 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, the new owner of the Grand Palace hotel chain." The lobby went completely silent. Mr. Wilson stared at the card, then at Thomas, his face draining of all color. That's not possible," he stammered. "The sale hasn't been announced." "The press release goes out tomorrow afternoon," Thomas confirmed. "The papers are being signed in the morning. I was in the middle of finalizing the deal when I got calls and messages about how my mother was being treated at my hotel." Betty gasped softly beside him. "Tommy, you bought the hotel?" "This hotel?" Thomas squeezed his mother's hand. "I wanted it to be a surprise, Mom. I know how much this place means to you and Dad." Jessica's mouth had dropped open. Kevin, the security guard, was trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile, and Mr. Wilson looked like he might faint. "Mr. Williams," he began, "I had no idea." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Thomas interrupted. "You had no idea who my mother was. You just saw an elderly black woman and decided she didn't belong in your fancy hotel." Mr. Wilson opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. "If you had treated her with basic human dignity and checked her reservation properly, you would never have known who I was," Thomas continued. "But you didn't, and now everyone here knows exactly who you are." The crowd that had gathered was watching intently. Some people were nodding in agreement, others were recording the scene on their phones. "My first act as owner," Thomas announced, "will be to implement a complete overhaul of staff training on diversity and inclusion at all 12 Grand Palace locations." He turned to the lobby at large. The Grand Palace was built on the idea that luxury should be accessible to all who can afford it, regardless of what they look like. Somewhere along the way, that vision was lost. I intend to restore it. People began to applaud. Betty looked up at her son with pride shining in her eyes. Thomas turned back to Mr. Wilson, who now looked physically ill. "As for you, Mr. Wilson," Thomas said quietly, "I'd like you to personally escort my mother to the presidential suite. And then I'd like you to clear up your office." "You're firing me?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice barely a whisper. Consider it a computer error, Thomas replied. One that only affects certain people. 3 months later, Betty Williams stood nervously in the grand ballroom of the Grand Palace Hotel. The room was filled with people, hotel staff wearing new uniforms, community leaders, and even a few reporters with cameras. "I can't believe you talked me into this," she whispered to Thomas, who stood beside her in a crisp suit. "You're the perfect person for the job, Mom," Thomas assured her. Who better to train hotel staff than a teacher with 42 years of experience? Betty smoothed down her new dress. After the incident with Mr. Wilson, which had gone viral online and been picked up by several news outlets, Thomas had made big changes at all 12 Grand Palace locations. He'd fired Mr. Wilson that very night and promoted Jessica to assistant manager after seeing how she tried to help Betty. But the biggest change had been the new training program that all staff members were required to complete, a program that Betty had helped design. "It's time," Thomas said, guiding his mother to the small stage at the front of the ballroom. Thomas stepped up to the microphone first. "Thank you all for coming today. 3 months ago, an unfortunate incident at this hotel revealed a problem that exists not just here, but throughout the hospitality industry, and indeed throughout our society." The crowd grew quiet, many nodding in recognition of the story they'd all heard. "My mother was judged not by her reservation, not by her decades of loyal patronage, but by the color of her skin and her appearance. She was humiliated and removed from this very building." Betty looked down at her hands, the memory still painful. "What happened next changed not just our family, but this entire hotel chain," Thomas continued. "Instead of simply firing one manager and moving on, we decided to address the root of the problem. And for that, we needed an expert teacher." He turned and held out his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the architect of our new Dignity First training program and the new Director of Staff Education for Williams Hospitality Group, my mother, Mrs. Betty Williams." The room erupted in applause as Betty stepped forward to the microphone. Her legs felt shaky, but her voice came out clear and strong, the same voice that had commanded classrooms of energetic children for over 4 decades. "I never expected to start a new career at 78, Betty began, earning gentle laughter from the crowd. "But some lessons are too important not to share." She looked out at the faces watching her, young and old, all different colors and backgrounds. "For 42 years, I taught children that mathematics has rules that don't change based on who you are. 2 + 2 = 4 whether you're rich or poor, young or old, no matter what you look like or where you come from." Betty paused, making eye contact with several people in the audience. Dignity should be the same way. Every person who walks through those doors, she pointed to the hotel entrance, deserves to be treated with the same respect. Not because they might be secretly rich or powerful, not because their son might own the hotel. Several people chuckled at this. But because treating people with dignity is simply the right thing to do. The room fell silent, taking in her words. "The Dignity First program isn't complicated," Betty continued. "It teaches staff to check their assumptions at the door, to listen before judging, to remember that every guest has a story you don't know yet." Kevin, now the head of security, nodded from his position near the wall. "What happened to me was painful," Betty admitted. "But good can come from pain if we learn from it, and I believe the Grand Palace has learned." As she finished speaking, the room filled with applause. Thomas hugged his mother, his eyes shining with pride. Later that evening, Betty sat in the hotel restaurant with Thomas, enjoying a meal prepared specially by the chef. Through the window, they could see the sun setting over the city, painting the sky in beautiful colors. "Your father would be so proud of you," Betty said, reaching across the table to squeeze her son's hand. Thomas smiled. "He'd be proud of both of us, Mom. You're changing more lives now than you ever did in the classroom." Betty looked around the restaurant, noticing how the staff greeted each guest with the same warm welcome, regardless of what they were wearing or how they looked. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "the most important lessons come when we least expect them." And as she raised her glass in a toast to her son, Betty Williams knew that this unexpected chapter of her life might turn out to be the most meaningful one of all.